So we'll kick this panel off just to remind ourselves on the topic. It's on relationships, but to be honest, that we've actually been through a lot of sessions on relationships through the day. And we're now going to get into a sort of the complex relationship when there's three parties. The sponsor, the service provider, and the consultant. When does it work, when doesn't it work, and what are best practices? Because when you are contracting with a service provider, you've got to have sufficient subject matter expertise to actually have that interface. Are you, as the sponsor, going to rely totally on the supplier's expertise? Have you hired that expertise internally, or do you contract with a consultant? And then do you give that consultant leave to run the relationship with the supplier, or do you wish to manage it yourself? There's many, many ways to cut this cake, and having sat on all three sides of the table, if you will, as a contractor, as a sponsor, and as a consultant, I've seen the good and the bad, and we've put together a stellar panel of individuals who also represent the different aspects of this three-way relationship. To my left, Jen, who's a pharmaceutical company outsourcer at the moment, Jeff Saunders, a consultant, and Mike Settles, who's a service provider. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of these three different areas. So I'm not going to introduce myself any further because I think Shelley's fantastically done that, and thank you, Shelley. But I'll turn to my fellow panelists and ask them to introduce themselves before we get into the meat of the discussion. So perhaps I can start at the far end with Mike.
My name is Mike Settles, and I own a company called TGA Sciences Incorporated. We've been in business for about 22 years. We're a contract R&D laboratory that offers basic R&D services as well as regulated work. We also have an animal facility. We do a wide range of different pieces of work for a wide range of different clients, and we're located in Medford.
Jeff Saunders. I'm currently a consultant in the early discovery space, trained as a chemist. Historically, I was in very early at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Interestingly, one of the most insular organizations on the face of the earth. We outsourced very little, and nobody knew what they were doing if they were doing any of our outsourced chemistry. I left there in 2003, and my next opportunity was with a company called Elixir. And this was a very interesting time and space because we chose to have a fully virtual chemistry undertaking there. So quite a change, and learning about understanding the challenges of managing a team on the other side of the ocean, initially in the UK, but then to Asia, was a very exciting time. And learned a lot about the energy that it takes to build those relationships and maintain them, and maintain the trust that's absolutely necessary to get the most out of those relationships. After I left Elixir, I joined Agios, where I think I built one of the strongest drug discovery teams I've ever known. Very successful. We took that outsourcing model that I had put together at Elixir to a very different level. Working with half a dozen different CROs on multiple continents and coordinating all the compound and data and information exchange. Happy to say that Agios launched its first drug out of that effort just about a month and a half ago. I left Agios to go to another startup company called Ember Therapeutics, adopted the same model. Ultimately, we got into an alliance with a pharmaceutical company that was only interested in the biological side of things, so I left there. And then I was working to help start a company focused on post-traumatic stress disorder. Unfortunately, funding for psychiatrics is still very, very challenging. So beginning of this year, I came back to the business doing consulting, focused primarily on very early stage companies. So I've been on both sides of it. I haven't been on the CRO side, but certainly both sides of the hiring consultants and being a consultant myself.
Thank you, Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen Rocknick. I'm head of oncology biology at Nimbus Therapeutics, which is a small biotech in Cambridge. We do small molecule drug discovery in the areas of oncology, immunology, and metabolic disease. So we only have about 25 full-time employees, and we're a completely virtual company, so we have no labs at all. We rely solely on a large network of consultants, CROs, and academic collaborators for all of our research. So have a lot of experience working with consultants as well as CROs.
Thank you. And before we discuss the relationship including the consultant, let's just sort of remind ourselves, what does a good relationship between an outsourcer and a service provider look like? Perhaps I can start with Mike again.
A good contract, I guess. Well, most of our clients come to us and they're obviously in need of mainly R&D. Well, that's really where our specialty sort of focuses in on. So I feel that we're very flexible. I feel that we meet our clients' needs very well, and I think that we provide a very good service as compared to some of the larger companies. In fact, we get a lot of clients from the larger companies. But I think one of the biggest things is we do work with a lot of consultants, and once you are able to show those consultants that you are efficient, that you know what you're doing, that you ask questions when you don't know what you're doing, and make everything transparent, you then start to generate a very good personal relationship with these consultants. And I think that's one of our biggest sort of marketing things, where these consultants go from company to company, and certain problems come up, certain issues, certain assays that they need to be developed and validated or whatever, and they remember you. And we have probably half a dozen really good consultants that continually contact us, over a certain period, and bring us into their new contacts or their new contracts. So I think that's, I really focus on, as far as the consultant piece, that's what I really try to focus on, trying to keep the consultants happy, because once you get the consultants happy and, they think highly of you, then really, they're going to bring you in and to their companies that they're consulting for. So I think that's really key for us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think it's absolutely critical to get into a mutually beneficial relationship as well, and developing, as I said earlier, that trust that you're fully, at least fully enough in the know to understand how best to consult, how best to ask questions of all folks involved. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. And just add to that, I think the most important piece is, having really good communication. For me, it's not dissimilar to leading project teams in big companies where everybody was internal, but, to be able to have really good communication with your consultants, with your CROs, frequent phone calls, Skype meetings, in-person visits as much as possible, and really make sure that you're aligned and everybody's clear on the priorities and goals and deliverables. I think, that forms a really good working relationship.
I think you've just hit upon one of the pieces that I think is key, and I'm not sure, I know I haven't seen it work all the time. You've got these three groups, or these three individuals. Who's leading what? Who is the person in control of the program? Is that always clear, or is that something that needs to be cleared? Jen, maybe I can ask you first this time.
Yeah, I think ultimately the pharma company is the one financially investing in it, so they ultimately have decision power, but I think you have to make sure that you empower the people that you're working with. Especially if you're paying for a consultant, presumably you're hiring them and working with them because they're expert in that area. So I think it's really good to build up that relationship where you trust them, you're aligned, but that you let them, drive the expertise area that you've invested in them for. So.
Do you ask them to interface and direct the work of the supplier, or do you take that on yourself?
So we do. At Nimbus, for example, we have a number of consultants that are really embedded within our organization. So they're on site a couple of days a week. We meet with them all the time, and we let them drive the service providers. I mean, usually where, myself, one of the other team members is present for the meetings, but we really let them, they're the ones that are the experts in the specific technology, for example, structural biology or CMC that we might have going on. We don't have that internal expertise. So we rely heavily on our consultants to drive and direct the CRO with our, kind of input and acknowledgement and approval going all along.
Thank you. Jeff, your experiences there?
Yeah, I've experienced that on both sides, and it's nice to be appreciated as a consultant, as someone who's adept at what he or she does, and to be given the reins to the extent everybody's comfortable with it. I would never push beyond anybody's comfort level, but clients that I'm working for now, they clearly bring me in because I've been doing this for 400 years, and they expect that I know what I'm doing. So,
I think in my experience, at least, there's two types of consultants that we generally deal with. The first being those consultants that are representing virtual companies, or a couple PhDs with money to spend, or that have been hired by a VC. They tend to have a lot more, ability to call the shots and to direct us in a certain way. We've dealt with other consultants that are hired by larger, pharmaceutical companies, and they seem to have a lot more rein on them, as far as what they can do, as far as what they can, spend or approve to have spent. I've seen it in both ways, and those are the two types of consultants that we've generally worked with in the past.
So I can open it up to the floor if there's anybody got any questions or points that they would like to speak to in this discussion on relationships with three parties.
It's over there.
Oh, there's a couple of questions coming.
Over there.
Thank you.
Yes, this is Jimbo Lee, and I work in a Cambridge company here. And the question I have, I think this is three-party collaboration, really important, especially the role of consultant. One of the key things between collaboration between biotech and CRO is the project management piece. I wonder if you can comment on that. The importance of experienced consultant to help to manage that type of relationship.
Who would like to go first?
I can, the project management, all I can say is that before I started this company, I worked for 3 or 4 different pharmaceutical biotech companies for about 15 years. And when we tried to, outsource this type of work, it just seemed like every time we would call whoever we were working with as far as the contractor, we had to, the project management changed. We have to update somebody new, let's start this all over. So I try not to do that. I mean, we're a pretty small company. We're under 20 people. So I feel that we really, when a project manager is put on a project, that person is going to be the contact. And I realize that, because we're small, I'm still involved. That the client can call me if there's an issue or anything. But I think that's very important to, for the reputation of your company, especially when you're changing project managers every 2-3 months. I know a lot of the larger CROs do have that turnover, and I agree with you. That can be a huge headache.
Anyone else want to pick it up?
Yeah, Jimbo, I wasn't sure if you were referring to project manager internal in the scientific organization or the CRO. I think a project manager within the company, like a project manager within Nimbus, that's a full-time job. You want that person immersed and all-consuming. But I think that also extends to the CRO space, as we just heard. When you can't have that variability. You need that consistency, that phrase I like to use, institutional knowledge. And I usually refer to that within the company like Nimbus, but I think if you're part of a very solid CRO pharma relationship, that knowledge base has to be maintained and expanded.
So, thank you for that question. Any other questions from the floor? Just in the front here.
Before we get there, has anyone had a different experience than what we were just referring to?
Well, I can speak to that. I was in Patheon, a larger supplier, and we were working with some huge pharma. And it's very interesting, the huge pharma were very forgiving of them turning over project managers, but very unforgiving of us turning over project managers. And in the same way you say you have to educate somebody, we were spending a lot of time educating their project manager, who was the sponsor, as to what we were doing on their project and the direction. So it's a bit double-edged. I find that sponsoring companies are very unforgiving of changes in the service provider, whatever they are, although project management is very sensitive. And when it happens, it has to be handled very carefully. It will happen, whatever size of company. And there is a belief that if I'm cutting a check, I'm going to get exactly what I got before. Well, life isn't quite like that. That was my experience, but to the point, anybody else got an experience of that before we move on to your question in a moment? Experiences of changing of project managers in the middle of your project? If not, we'll go to the question.
Hi, this is Paul Blundell from Organics. I have a question for consultants and how you manage conflicts of interest. So prior projects from prior clients, how do you handle any conflicts of a current client? So say you're working on some therapeutic area with a prior client, and now a current client wants you to switch to this therapeutic area where you have knowledge. How do you handle that situation?
Yeah, for me, that's very straightforward. If there's any question that there would be an overlap of therapeutic interests, anytime I'm being approached for a new consulting opportunity, I don't tell that potential client what else I've done, but I say, can you give me very high level? And then if I have to bore down into that even more, ultimately, I would never do anything like that. You can't.
Your reputation is at stake, and we live and die by our reputation.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty tight community here, as we all know.
Perhaps we can extend that into service providers. What about conflicts of interest within service providers if you're approached?
Yeah, I mean, it's, well, you know, as a service provider, you know, we're blinded a lot. So, you know, we're asked to develop certain assays, certain methods, validate them, et cetera. And many times, you know, we're not even sure of what, you know, we're doing as far as, you know, very rarely basically does a client come in and sit down and go over the program's objectives, right? They just basically say, we need an assay for this, you know, PK study we're doing or whatever. So yeah, I mean, we do obviously work for many companies in the same area, but you know, we have confidentiality agreements. I mean, obviously none of my technicians really are going to take the time to figure out exactly what, you know, the drug, you know, what it's made or whatever. So yeah, that doesn't seem to come up too much.
Fair enough.
We have, I mean, in my experience, we've had kind of two different options. So there's some where we work with large CROs where, you know, we've known that there's been conflicts, but, you know, you try to request that the people haven't worked on it specifically. But if it's just, you know, a routine assay, again, you're not sharing chemical structures. They might have assay know-how, but you're not really giving much detail. But conversely, we've had some arrangements where we've had exclusivity with the contract provider, where we've usually paid for exclusivity on the target. So, you know, especially if it's a small shop and they're doing something really unique, then my company will actually pay for exclusivity for a certain time frame where they can't work on it. And similarly, we have another large research collaboration where we're exploring a model where we're fully embedded with one service provider. So, you know, they're contributing to all of the chemistry, biology, et cetera. And with that organization, they've specifically segregated the people working on that program to make sure that, you know, they're working on all in one site and that they won't work on that target again within that site of the organization of a multi-site company. So.
And actually, I have experience of that at Patheon, where because it's a large company, we could take on a similar project, but we actually made sure it went to a different site and made sure that each team was aware they could not talk to the other team about that project and have them sign to that effect, which is as much as you can do.
Right, right. Yeah, we've had situations where we'll be approached by a new client that wants us to do a particular type of assay or whatever, and they'll ask us our experience in it, and they want a case study with actual data. Yeah. And it's just like, no, we can't do that. We just can't give out that. So, yeah.
Question from the floor.
Yes, my name is Yves Roy from Coriolis. We're a CRO in formulation development of a drug product. And sometimes, unfortunately, the client comes with consultants that has no experience in our field. And it's placing us in a very delicate position because he doesn't know what we're doing, he doesn't know anything. And because the client hires this guy, because they don't know anything, they can judge on his competency. So it's like Colin mentioned before, we need to train them, educate the consultants, and to formulate the question to ask to his client or common client. So, but this is a very difficult position, and it's, I wouldn't say often, but it happens on a regular basis. And very often the consultant is more experienced in preclinical or drug substance manufacturing, or so when it gets into the CMC drug product development, he's completely lost. He doesn't know what to ask, or he asks things that are completely unrealistic. So it puts us in a very difficult position when you have a teleconference call where he asks things for the client, and it's, you know my point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how do you handle it?
How do you deal with that? And my question goes to everyone, but especially Jen, it happens to you, or because it's a difficult position to be in terms of a CRO.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because
Yeah, I haven't personally been in that position, and I guess, we always like to think that we're hiring the people that are the right person for the job, right? So I guess it's, really up to the company to make sure that they're, having good communication with the consultant, make sure that they realize, or if they have a sense that they have a handle on what's going on, right? That, hopefully, if you're on the sponsor side, you should get a good sense, even if you don't understand the expertise, the technical expertise, you should know that the person, has command of it, that they seem to grasp what's going on and that they understand the priorities. So I think ultimately the responsibility is up to the sponsor to make sure that their consultant, knows what they're doing. But again, I think it's probably just better, having that communication and, having the sponsor be involved in those conversations at least at some point too, to, kind of make sure they know what's going on.
I think a concern with that is this: nobody on the sponsor side knows how to ask the right questions, and I have to say I have been in that space. But I'll put it back to you. What do you do in that space? What have you done? Have you ever gone to the sponsor and say, I think we've got an issue here?
Well, you need to take your diplomacy out there. And so what we do is, before the teleconference call, we brief them, and we educate we try to educate the consultants. This is what we do. Because, when you have the sponsor, which is your client, it's difficult to tell them that they made a wrong choice. It's a lot of diplomacy, and we're not trying to expose the consultant also on the, to crucify the consultant. It's tough. It's not easy. It's not easy.
In our experience, usually if we're working with a consultant like that, that doesn't really have a grasp of what's going on, that usually shows up pretty quickly during conference calls and such. So we've, like I said, if it's a consultant that we've worked with, or for a long time, and that's brought us a lot of clients and such, I kind of hang back and let things happen, and many times, the director of the client that we're working for, or whoever's on the phone, will see that, you know, during these conference calls, that they're not really adding much, that, you know, they're kind of, like their dog is barking in the background, you know, or whatever, right? So, you know, usually it settles itself for the most part, to tell you
Like
the
I
truth.
can speak to this. I've had direct experience in my Patheon days, where the client, we started talking to a drug product naive client, and they realized that they needed to bring in a consultant, and and we advised on a few names, but they chose an individual who, when they were brought in, was in that same position that Eve was speaking to, that they really didn't understand it, and to a large extent, they were trying to points score to justify their existence.
Right.
And so, you know, after a few weeks, after a few rounds of this, you know, we huddled in our team. What are we going to do about this? It's a very, very difficult situation. Do we tell the client that's not going to work, because, you know, it becomes a he said, she said sort of situation, and, you know, it's the big dollars going behind our eyes. That's how that would be perceived. Do you want to, in the conference call, show up the individual? You've got to be very sensitive and careful there. So, you know, hopefully the sponsor recognizes something. But as a contract provider, we found it to be one of the most difficult situations, and it's actually where it was to the detriment of the sponsor, because we were effectively told, go up this direction. We had the expertise to know that that direction was not going to work. And we did our best to persuade the sponsor to back off. We weren't going to persuade the consultant. They didn't know what they were doing. And we did the work they paid for, and it didn't work. And we kept CYA records, for those of us who know what CYA means, cover your backside, to make sure that it wasn't going to come back on us. And then when it was a blind alley, the customer had paid for that to going down there. We didn't want to send the customer down there, but we couldn't figure out a way out of it.
Right.
Another question, please.
Hi, yes, Evan Guggenheim from Biogen. So I've been doing a decent amount of outsourcing at Biogen, but actually haven't used consultants. So I'm curious, this is coming from a little bit of not knowing the space as well, but it sounds like the role of a consultant, the expectation of the role of the consultant at companies could be different. You have technical expertise, maybe a little bit of procurement, a little bit of project management, a little bit of performance management, and I would imagine even into like administrative help for sort of managing that relationship. Is that true? And you know, how do you deal with the sort of different expectations that the innovator companies are going to have for the help that they need from that type of role?
Anyone care to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's very true. I've hired a lot of consultants for very different roles, and I've been a consultant in different roles. It's about making sure you really have to do your homework. It's like any hire that you're going to make. You don't have dinner with someone and then say, okay, great, you're my CMC consultant. It's really understanding what that person knows and what he or she doesn't know. And there was something else I was going to say, but it left my brain. So.
Yeah, we've actually hired consultants to help us out, particularly with statistics, because we're not really heavy on statistics. We're more, you know, technical assistants. And, you know, I mean, it is tough because you got to take their word that they know exactly what they're doing. But, you know, as long as you keep it transparent with your clients that, you know, we're hiring this person to help out on the stats side, and everything will be run by your, you know, biostatisticians. You know, you know, we've had some luck. We've had some, you know, consultants that have not worked out at all. But again, you know, you find out pretty quickly, you know, when they're working on a particular project and you present this data to your client, and the client kind of looks at you like you're crazy. But otherwise, you know, we've had a pretty good success with many of our consultants that we've hired for specific pieces of work.
I think it's just defining your need up front. So, we have consultants that we've worked with for very short periods of time for a specific technical need that we know we only need someone for, a couple of months to do X, and we'll bring that in. Where we have others where it's almost like a full-time employee. This person is really embedded within the company. They spend a lot of time. They're there a lot, and they work for many, many years. We've had consultants working with us for 6 or 7 years. So I think it's really just upfront for the company to define what the need is, and then mirroring what Jeff said too is really vetting the consultants really well. So really do interviewing extensively, doing reference checks as if you were hiring the person on to really kind of get a sense of if that person can meet your needs.
So in one of my jobs in a multinational company, we actually bought an asset, and that asset came with a consultant who'd spent their whole the whole life of that asset developing it. So we retained that consultant. Normally a multinational wouldn't necessarily retain consultants with an asset. They'll take it in and they've got their own in-house expertise. But we made the call that this person had so much embedded knowledge that we didn't want to lose that, so we kept it. And we ensured that they were, and they'd also been front and center in the relationship with the CDMOs that they've been working with. So we didn't want to upset that apple cart. So we said, we're retaining you, please continue, and we'll work with you. And over time, over a couple of years, that individual was still retained, but did much less work directly with the contractors. So that's on the multinational side. And again, from my contracting experience, every size of company with the maturity of its company utilizes consultants differently. If you're a startup, you haven't got any of that internal expertise at all. You're going to rely on this expert that you've hired, and you really do need to have done the right diligence in hiring the right expert. Smaller companies usually at some point will hire in some of that expertise and maybe retain their consultants. So it depends on the stage of maturity of the company as to how they utilize consultancies. That's my experience, and how much autonomy they give. A big pharma is unlikely to give a consultant autonomy at spending its money, whereas a smaller company might need to because they don't understand exactly what's involved. Anything else from the floor? So let's turn to a slightly different topic again with consultants. Oh, there is a question? Oh, we have the lights here. It's very difficult to see.
It's hard to see.
Hi, I'm Narissa Samad from Eurofins Alfora. So we're a contract development manufacturing API company. And I just, as you guys were talking about relationships between consultants, CRO, and the sponsor, I recalled an experience that I had where the sponsor believed very much in having the consultant and the vendor work together on problems. So with this particular program, there was a problem. There were multiple problems, technical issues, and the conference calls would have, 3 or maybe a couple of consultants on that side. Just wanted to get your advice on how you would handle a situation where you can have off-tangent conversations with the sponsor. This ended up happening in this particular situation. The sponsor and the consultants would end up bantering over what was the right solution. The vendor would, at the beginning of the call, okay, this is the problem, these are the options we have laid out, and then the customer, the sponsor company, and the consultants would then banter for about 2 hours on what to do. And the vendor company sitting there going, can you guys make up your mind? Have you had that kind of experience as a consultant or as on the vendor side, or even as a sponsor side? I think for the sponsor, they like having all the experts on the call so that we can troubleshoot issues together, but if you can comment on how you would handle a situation like that.
I've been in that position, and I think it's the same as if you were in, an internal project meeting where people goes off. You just have to be able to manage the meeting and say, okay, why don't you have the discussion, on the side, and we can come back and get back to it. You can't just try to derail the conversation. And I think it's the job of, ultimately, if it's not going to resolve itself, it's ultimately the job of the sponsor to, kind of say, to direct them to have the discussion offline and get back to the team with a recommendation.
Yeah, I think along the lines of the same way you would do it within an internal meeting, It's important, this goes back to something that we said right at the start, it needs to be clear who is the decision maker. Is it the sponsor, is it the consultant, is it the CRO? And who, if it's the sponsor, who within the sponsor's team is that person? And that's just, for me, that's pretty basic meeting management. So you got to nip that in the bud.
Yeah, I think that, we have had, I've seen that where we're on a conference call with multiple consultants and an issue comes up after we've presented data and there seems to be, then we're silent because all of a sudden, there's a big issue. Usually we're left out of that and we only know who won by who remains on the next conference call. So we're not generally involved in that. We pretty much just present the data that we're generating and then they sort of dogfight it out. But we have had that in the past.
And to get closure on that, in the two companies that I've been in where we are service providers, I rely on our project manager to say, internally, we're confused, we don't know what direction to go in, and then reach out to the client, usually the sponsor, to say, we're not clear on what direction we've been given because we presented you this data, there was this debate, and we're not clear on the absolute direction. Let's make sure that we spend your money wisely. We're not going to, we're not sure. Did you want experiment A or B or protocol to be rewritten this way? And I look to good project management internally to make that happen. Now, to Jeff's point, it's up to the sponsor to make sure it's clear, but sponsors don't always do that. They might, sponsor might believe it is clear, but then as the service provider, you're going, well, I'm not quite sure what they're doing. So I think it's incumbent upon our internal people to reach out and say, I'm not clear, let's make sure that we do the right thing. I don't know, would you agree?
Yes, definitely.
Another question at the back there, please.
Rahul Chaturvedi from Clora. We're talking quite a bit about consultants, and I've been on the hiring side of consultants as well as been a consultant, and would love to hear the panel's perspective on where the industry is headed in terms of hiring the right consultants when you need it. And it's been fairly inefficient for me, so would love to hear thoughts on challenges that the industry faces and what we can do to improve.
Anybody care to start? Have you, Jen, maybe with you, have you had trouble finding the right consultants?
Only very rarely. I'd say in general it takes some work, but we've usually been able to identify the consultants we need. I can only think of one particular example where it was really hard because it was a very specialized assay that we were looking for expertise in, and we just couldn't find anybody with really extensive expertise. But in general, we've been able to find it. I think it just takes work, right? It takes work on the company's part to identify the people. And usually, for what I do is if I need a consultant for a specific area, I just reach out into my network, right? And I work with a lot of other people, or have worked with people in the past that work at companies similar to mine where they rely heavily on consultants. So reaching out into the network and finding who's an expert in this area that you can work with.
Jeff, you said you've hired consultants before. How do you go about finding them?
Yeah, I think that's one of the features of working here for a while in the Boston-Cambridge area. It really is a tight community. It's very easy to find people, not all the time very easy, but usually quite easy to find people and get multiple names from people that you've known. Part of my role as a consultant has often been, hey, do you know anybody that does mass spec, or whatever the experiment or assay needed to be. So developing and maintaining a network is a critical part of that. But I've had pretty good success with it.
Yeah, most of the consultants that we work with are, found by our clients. We do have a few that we use from time to time, but for the most part, it's really the client's responsibility to choose the consultant. Although, obviously I have a lot of contacts, and like Jeff said, there's a ton of, consultants out there. So.
As somebody who's been a consultant, gone back into industry and coming out again and actually moved geographies, one of the challenges I'm finding is getting my name out there, because yes, I'm part of networks, but my networks aren't as mature in this geography. So there are challenges out there. So we're all, I think a lot of us are here today because of the networking opportunities, and I think that is part of doing what we do to do the business. Any other questions from the floor at the moment? Oh, gentleman on the left, on my left here.
Hi, how you doing? My name is Paul Fabre. I work with a company called BioBridges. We're a biotech support firm that supports clients that are doing some form of drug, device, or biologic development. And the question that I have actually just became relevant on an email I got. But it's about recent experience in a therapeutic area from a consultant standpoint. One of the things that consultants are good at is being adaptable and able to hit the ground running relatively quickly. But when you have such complexity in trials, especially in oncology, you can speak to this probably directly, how important is it for someone who understands how to adapt quickly, who's supposed to come into an environment and hit the ground running as a consultant, how important is it for them to have a therapeutic area experience that's within a couple of years? If somebody says, I've done oncology, but it's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, does that put them out of the running for somebody to support you, given that they know how to adapt quickly and can catch themselves up to new programs?
I think it depends on what you're using the consultant for. I mean, if it's something, for example, structural biology, right? I mean, it doesn't matter whether the person's had experience in oncology or anything else, right? It's a completely different expertise. But if I was looking for a consultant to work on, cell biology assays that were relevant to oncology, then you'd want somebody with the relevant background. So I think it really depends on what the need is and how applicable that relevant background is.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't want someone that hasn't, worked in the field for 10 years. I mean, there's all sorts of new things coming up. An example would be like neutralization bioassays. It's kind of a new field. It's kind of a new, sort of thing that's moving into clinical trials to support them. And yeah, you obviously want someone that has some experience, in that to help you along. So.
Well, in some way, you are hiring a consultant because of their subject matter expertise, and the expectation is they're up to speed on it, or if not, why would you be hiring them now?
Right.
Good point.
Right.
We have a few moments left. If there are any last questions from the floor, please. So let me just close with a question from here. So here you are in a two-party relationship between yourself and the supplier, or you are the supplier and the sponsor yourself. Now a consultant's been brought in. Have you ever had an experience of where somebody's been brought into the relationship where now there's a reset? Have you had that experience?
What do you mean, reset with the whole project?
Well, no, essentially a reset in the relationships. You've been running, a sponsor's been running it with you, and now a new party's been brought in, maybe as a consultant. Have you had that experience, and were there any challenges when that happened?
Getting them up to speed. I mean, off the top of my head, I can remember one instance where we had worked for a company for about 3 or 4 years, and all of a sudden they decided to go virtual, and all of a sudden they brought in all these consultants, and they actually went from 50 people to about 4 or 5. Wow. And it was us educating those people, and it got to be so time consuming that I basically said, well, you're going to have to charge us to, as an FTE to educate your consultants on where we are with everything. We had freezers filled with their reagents and such. So yeah, I mean, we have run into that. It took it was probably a 3-month delay.
So they got a time hit, and you actually had to go back to them and say, hold on, you're using
pretty
up
much.
time.
Yeah, pretty much. Educate them. Yeah.
Anyone, Jeff, you had that sort of experience where you had a relationship going and then suddenly other people were brought in?
Yeah, it wasn't particularly pleasant since that consultant and myself didn't see eye to eye on several things. The flip side of that, though, is, like, for instance, the early days of Agios, when it was just me and one other drug designer, I brought in multiple consultants because I was looking for that diversity of thought. You can go down a rabbit hole pretty quickly if you're too focused without a diverse set of voices in your head.
Well, thank you, everybody. We're just coming up to the end of timing now. Perhaps we could thank our panel.
Good job.
Thank you.